All right, the more detailed for the nervous system part of breathing. So here's the pons, here's the medulla, and this whole thing is the brainstem. The pons ends up influencing the rate of breathing. Okay, so the pons, we have the rate of breathing, whereas the medulla sets the rhythm. Okay, so for example, the rate would be 12 breaths per minute. Okay, so that would be the function of the pons. And the rhythm has to do with muscle control. Okay, so this is going to be more. Okay, so is it choppy? Is it smooth? All right, so that's going to be the medulla, is to set the rhythm of the breathing. Okay, the pons has a specific structure within it called the pontine respiratory group, or the PRG. Okay, and you'll notice that some signals go from the PRG down to the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG. Now, it's dorsal because it's another name for dorsal is posterior, and this structure is literally posterior, located posteriorly. Well, if you have a dorsal respiratory group, then you have to have a ventral respiratory group. So that's just the rules of naming anatomy parts. If they give you a directional term, it's because you have the other one. So if you have a right lung, it's because you have a left lung. If you have a dorsal respiratory group, you'll have a ventral respiratory group. Okay, so the PRG, the pontine respiratory group, does communicate with the dorsal respiratory group. That is influenced by cranial nerve 10, also known as the vagus nerve. Okay, the vagus nerve is a very powerful parasympathetic nerve, okay, which means this is your rest and digest nerve. So it's going to put you in parasympathetics, put you in calm. So in the technique, there's a therapy technique called cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. One of the first things that they'll teach you is deep breathing. Okay, they'll say just breathe through it. Well, why? Well, the answer is because you're stimulating cranial nerve 10, which is a parasympathetic nerve, which is a rest and digest nerve, which means it is a calming nerve. So this is why this is one of the techniques in cognitive behavioral therapy that they teach people, is because when you are stressed or anxious or anything like that, how can you quickly calm yourself down? Deep breathing. Okay, and what you're doing is stimulating that vagus nerve, which then stimulates that dorsal respiratory group, which then stimulates the pontine group, which then stimulates, look at this, the limbic system and higher brain centers, which gets you under better emotional regulation. Okay, so deep breathing is very important. In fact, you don't have to be anxious to deep breathe. You can actually just practice for a few minutes a day deep breathing, because of how good that is for the lungs, for the stroma of the lungs, the elastic connective tissue in the lungs, gas exchange, conditioning, air and ventilation, and so many other health benefits to deep breathing. Okay, so on a side note, if you want to geek out on that, there's plenty of information online. You just type in the benefits of deep breathing or the benefits of deep breathing for the purpose of relaxation and calming, and you'll get a bunch of hits. The quick version is just spend a few minutes a day, deep breath in, so max inhale, deep breath out, max exhale, because you are stimulating so many good neurological and mechanical pathways for breathing for health purposes. Okay, you'll also notice that there is a chemoreceptor, and this is going to be responsible to help you with pH through your gases, okay, such as CO2 and oxygen. So if you have too much CO2 buildup, then your chemoreceptors are going to pick up on that and force you to breathe faster to get rid of the carbon dioxide. If everything is calm, then those chemoreceptors are picking up on a more of a balanced acid-base balance or CO2 oxygen, so you're going to breathe calmer. Okay, so here's an example. If you start running, the metabolism in the body, the energy breakdown, the amount of oxygen being used because of the metabolic demand of running creates more CO2. So that actual chemical change, that pH change of CO2, the chemoreceptors pick up on that, which forces the ticks, so the synapses, to start firing faster, which is going to change the rate of your breathing. Okay, going back to what we said earlier, that the brainstem, the pons, is going to be responsible for the rate of the breathing, and the medulla is going to be responsible more for the rhythm. Okay, there are other nerves that are going to help with breathing, and some of them are the intercostal nerves, so inter or in between costal or rib. So these are the nerves in between the ribs, and you've got a lot of those. So essentially 12 pair of intercostal nerves, so nerves that innervate the right side and nerves that innervate the left side. They're going to help with breathing. And you have the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve is from C3, C4, and C5. So in other words, your neck or the cervical spine. So the nerves that come out of the neck at C3, C4, C5 bony area, they do come together to create the phrenic nerve. So the easy way to remember that is C3, C4, C5 keeps the diaphragm alive. So the phrenic nerve does go down and innervate the diaphragm. And that's another part that has a neurological wiring. So we have the brainstem itself, so the pons, the medulla, and then we have cranial nerve 10, so the vagus nerve, and then we also have the intercostal nerves, and we have the phrenic nerve. So there's a lot of neurological innervation that goes with breathing. Okay, the DRG, so the dorsal respiratory group, does communicate with the ventral respiratory group. All right, and here's what is pretty cool about the DRG and the VRG. Okay, the dorsal respiratory group is going to be responsible for inhale, and the ventral respiratory group is going to be responsible for exhale. Okay, if you notice, when you breathe in, you don't just keep breathing in. At some point, you stop and you turn it around and you start to breathe out. And you also don't just continue to exhale. At some point, you just stop, and neurologically, the body can turn it around and you start to inhale. So you have this reflex mechanism of inhale and exhale, and it follows kind of a very natural rhythm. But the reason why is because of the DRG and the VRG. Okay, a minute ago we mentioned the chemoreceptors that are in the brainstem, but we also have chemoreceptors that are located in our periphery. Okay, so they're located in the aortic arch, right? So you have chemoreceptors here. So chemoreceptors in the aortic arch, and you have chemoreceptors located in the carotid sinus, also known as the carotid body. Okay, so as far as the anatomy of our blood vessels, you have the external and internal carotid artery. As you can see here, there's the external and the internal carotid arteries. And the internals have a bulge, so that's also known as the carotid sinus. Okay, you can see the bulge there. And the yellow wires represent the nervous system. And so you can see that the carotid sinus is innervated by sensory fibers from cranial nerve 9. Okay, so glossopharyngeal nerve is cranial nerve 9. And it's sensory. Okay, sensory goes from body to brain. All right, that's neurologically, that's how we work. We sense it, so whatever the sensory thing is, it's going to go from body to brain. The brain is going to interpret it, and then it's going to send a motor response. All right, and in general, that's how we work. Sensory in, motor out. So cranial nerve 9 is a sensory nerve, so it's going to pick up on the chemical changes of CO2 versus oxygen. And this will also influence the rate of our breathing. So the more CO2 buildup, for example, from running, the faster you are going to breathe. Couple of definitions that you should know: that quiet breathing or normal breathing is called eupnea. And if you are breathing too fast, then that would be hyperventilation. Okay, that's in here. All right, hyperventilation is so hyper is too much. So this is when you're breathing too fast. And then the opposite of hyperventilation would be hypoventilation, where you're not breathing enough. And a person may turn blue or cyanotic from hypoventilation.